Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another Hit Save podcast. This is a format that we use for interviewing game developers, mostly indie developers. And today we have a fantastic guest with us. We actually have two new guests here. We got Tucker Hazell, who is one of our new interviewers. And together we'll be interviewing Ben Jelter. Welcome.
Good to be here.
And I'm happy to be a part of the team here as well. My first time here on Hit Save, and we're really going to dig deep into Ben's career. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is going to be super fun. For those who don't know Tucker, he also has another YouTube channel over at Backlog Banter Zero. And Ben, you can find over at benjelter.itch.io as well to check out the games. And so, Ben, we're going to dig into you for a bit here. You're a game designer, you're a comic creator, you create retro style games, many here for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And we're going to dig into those today. So tell us a bit about who you are, Ben, and how you got here.
Well, before I was a game developer, I was a comic book artist. I've also always been an art instructor. Long ago, since I graduated college, I always wanted to make video games, but I always found it to be kind of uh, overwhelmingly difficult since I'm not a programmer. I started a bunch of games, but never was able to get very far with them. The first game I worked on was maybe around 2009 or 2010. Um, but the first time I finished a game was December of 2019, I think. And that was the same day that I discovered GB Studio.
Interesting.
I made that game in a day in GB Studio.
Okay.
That was a quick turnaround, quick development time there.
Yeah, it was just messing around to see if I could use the program, and the program was so approachable that I was able to just quickly, because at that evening I was going to a drawing workshop with some friends,
Mhm.
and I wanted to actually be able to show them something I made on a Game Boy, but when I went there, and so I was really rushing. It was like a mini game jam.
Yeah, that's very cool. I am curious with your history as an illustrator and as an artist, if that skill that you'd built up over the years doing that, if you found that translated into creating games at all. Obviously, maybe with pixel art, but in something like design.
Yes and no. I mean, more yes than no, though. Like, I think making comic books, especially very long comic books, involves planning a like very large scale project and then working on it for a year or two. And so I think that lends itself very well to working on video games.
You know how to handle a long-term project.
Yeah, video games are very different though,
Mm.
because they're less of a linear progression. Like
Mhm.
when I draw comics, I'm actually like a robot. Like I write the script for the whole thing, and then I draw the roughs for the entire thing, and then I draw page one, draw page two, draw page three, draw page four until it's done. And with video games, it's kind of hard to work in such a linear way. You sort of need to identify like core systems and make sure that they work before you can just go from point A to point B. So luckily, I've been interested in game design for maybe 15 or 20 years. And so by the time I started doing game design, I already had read a ton about it. Actually, that's part of why it's fun to do something like this, because, this would be the type of thing that, you know, 15, 20 years ago, I would have been really especially interested in watching.
Yeah, of course, you can be the guy that inspires the next Ben Jelter.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you've been creating a bunch of really cool Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and you're using GB Studio. You discovered that a couple of years ago, and now you have a bunch of games out there. Some of the games that we're going to be talking about during this podcast is The Machine, the Metamorphosis Collection, and First Contact Protocol that just came out as well. So how how did you get started with GB Studio, and how do you create games in there? What does the creative process look like?
GB Studio, when it first came out, was very easy to make things very quickly with, because all you needed was a PNG file that was a specific amount of dimensions, and then because it's X pixels wide, the program knows what's going to be the frame of animation.
Mm.
So all you had to do to make a character is draw 6 pictures of the character and in a single PNG, and then they're automatically functional in the program. And
Wow.
you don't even need to like plug them into anything. It just knows because they're 6 frames in width that this is an animated 4 directional sprite. And so everything is a 2 frame animation. And you just draw 2 pictures of the actor facing down, 2 pictures of the actor facing up, and 2 pictures of the actor facing right. And then it will automatically populate it. So then you can then immediately run a build and walk around as that character. It's really fun.
Oh, that's cool. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Now, you said that that was how it worked. Is that still how it works, or was that changed?
It used to be the only way to make sprites. I actually don't know if it retains that functionality for sprites of that exact size. It might still do that, but it's so open ended now that that's certainly not how I make my sprites now. And this comes back to like something that I would say is if you're young or you're really a beginner when it comes to game development, I do recommend checking out GB Studio 1.2 because it is a lot simpler and forces you to make a lot less decisions or build a lot less of the groundwork for your game before you can just make it. In 2019, I discovered GB Studio 4.2, which is the beta that's around right now. I might have found it a little harder to use,
Sure. Yeah,
but
that's interesting.
because the program has slowly had features added since 2019, I've been able to easily keep up with everything.
Yeah. Well, I am curious why you sought out particularly Game Boy development as the first part of your more official game development career. Why not? Why that as opposed to Unity or Unreal or something that maybe is a little more applicable across genres and eras?
The brutal truth is Unity is way more complicated. And
True.
even though I understand a lot of how Unity works and I feel relatively comfortable in it, I feel like there's a lot of extra steps. I'm a big workflow person. I don't use Photoshop, I use Clip Studio Paint. And the reason that I use Clip Studio Paint is that I can rearrange all my palettes and shortcuts and even make my own tools that I can access with keyboard shortcuts I made up and have buttons on the screen in exactly the spots that I want them so that I can work as quickly as possible and make auto actions and make them buttons and then put them in exactly the right spot so that everything takes me like 10 seconds in the program. So anything that's just really cumbersome, I do not want to work with. And I found Unity to be like that the few times that I've used it.
Where do you find your inspiration for the games that you create? Looking at the machine that I've played here, it's very nonlinear. It has really interesting characters and is very dystopian as well. And it just has a really cool cast of characters. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone interested in digging into the game, but it's just really fun to go walk around and talk to everyone. It felt kind of like I'm back in the golden age of adventure games with Monkey Island and Simon the Sorcerer, where you walk around and you talk to everyone just to see if something else would pop up. So where do you get your inspiration for these games?
I mean, I guess I kind of think of games as art. So um, when I'm trying to make one, I'm trying to figure out how to justify its existence,
Hmm.
Mm.
because I don't think that we should just make things, just for the purpose of having made them and just to turn around and make money off of them. I feel like we should, try to advance human culture. And I thought that, there's a lot of Game Boy games. What could I do that would make a Game Boy game really worth playing compared to the other Game Boy games that already exist?
Mm.
Or how can it be valuable to a person who's not even necessarily into Game Boy games? Like, how how can I make it being a Game Boy game a strength as opposed to a weakness, right?
Sure.
Like even when it comes to reading fiction, I feel like the things that and watching movies, the things that make me feel the best, like I got the most enriching experience out of them, are things that kind of blow my mind. I
Mm.
wanted to see if I could create that experience for people with the machine. And so there's a uh, there's a game for the PlayStation 2. I forget exactly what it's called because I haven't played it. My friend played it and would always tell me that it was really cool because it was very nonlinear. Um, and I think it takes place in Japan. And yeah, you're like in a village and there's a lot of different paths that you can take through the game. When I played Shenmue for the first time, when I went to the arcade, it really blew my mind that they had like full 3D models of old Sega arcade games like Hang On,
Mhm.
and you could spend in-game currency to go play games at the arcade. Like to me, that felt so incredible. Like, wow, this game is so advanced that it has a game in it, like a full
Hmm.
game, like the cabinet and everything. And like I spend in-game money on it. That really impressed me. And then also, I remember a moment in Final Fantasy VII when leaving Midgar at the beginning of the game, fairly
Yeah, of course.
not the beginning, but fairly early in the game, and getting to the world map and looking at it and thinking to myself, "Wow, this game, like that city alone, was like a whole game, and there's an entire world."
Yeah. And then 20 years later, they made that part of the game an entire game.
Yeah, exactly. So my mind kind of melted when leaving Midgar in that moment. It was so impressive to me that I'll never forget it. And I was hoping that I might be able to create a similar experience for people on the Game Boy. And then I thought to myself, the main reason that people are always disappointed in nonlinear games is that most of the games that claim to be nonlinear are AAA games, and they're already sort of straining their budget to make the game in the first place. So if they made it truly nonlinear, it would just cost like 20 times as much money to make the game,
Mhm.
which is completely impossible. So they have to only pretend to be nonlinear. And so,
Interesting.
I thought back to like text-based adventures
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
were extremely nonlinear, but they were extremely nonlinear because the amount of work required to make them nonlinear was significantly less, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so my philosophy with this game was actually Game Boy is a huge strength because I can make it actually nonlinear because while it's not a text-based adventure, the art is simple and I'm an artist, so I can make the art that's required relatively quickly. And so I can make a game that has a scope that is kind of unfathomable for most games.
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't make like a giant 20-hour game that's also non-linear. Like a single playthrough could be like an hour or two, but I tried to make the number of paths. I have a friend who said that he played the game for over 25 hours and didn't see everything yet. So,
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what the modern Game Boy ecosystem is like in terms of people developing games, fans of modernly designed Game Boy games. Do you find it easy to get people interested in a game like this, or is that a challenge? You find strength within the development, but what is people's hunger for Game Boy games like in the current day? How expansive is like the group of people that are even touching this kind of software?
Well, that's a very good question, because I know that a lot of the time when I tell people that I make games for Game Boy, they go, "People will play that." People still play Game Boy. These are questions people ask me sometimes, and I think there's definitely truth to that. That it's very niche to make Game Boy games, but there's like I would say three main factors that are the reason that I developed Game Boy games at this point. One is I'm terrible at marketing. So I think that just the fact that it's a Game Boy game has like a built-in audience, which if I released a game on Steam, there would be fundamentally zero people who care off the bat, if that makes sense.
Sure.
The fact that it's a Game Boy game will interest at least, a handful of people, which means that there's a guaranteed number of eyes to begin with, which I think I need because I'm not going to be able to get in front of anybody. I'm like the type of person who doesn't use Twitter on principle or something like that. So you can see that I'm not exactly the, you know,
Yeah. Marketing's not your strongest suit.
yeah, exactly. The second reason I would say that I really like developing games for Game Boy is that Game Boy is to me the most special system because when I was young, like when I was around 9 or 10 years old, all my friends had Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and I would ask my parents for a Super Nintendo for Christmas every year, but they would never get me one. And they were very against me playing video games. And they bought me a Game Boy. So they weren't that against it. You know what I mean? It was like,
Mhm.
I think it was more like, especially my dad liked to watch the news and he didn't want, we only had one TV. So I think that he didn't want us to be using it, when he wanted to watch the news.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that was definitely a factor. Another factor is, they just subscribed to the idea that, they wanted us to spend time outside instead of, be quote couch potatoes. And then the last reason I guess was like that they were a little bit worried, or I don't know if they were worried until I got games like Resident Evil, but they were definitely worried that I would become violent from seeing violence in video games because that was a big fear in the 90s.
Sure was.
Trust me, it's still a fear today.
Yep.
Not a lot of super violent games on Game Boy though, so that makes sense as like an ecosystem you can introduce a child to.
Yeah, exactly. And it came with Tetris. But my dad was also, and I am also like this still. So this is not something that I really judge my parents for. Uh, he was anti-consumerist, so he thought that buying a video game system is sort of just an upsell scheme, and that
Mm.
then you basically are going to spend lots of money on games later. He saw it as like
He's right.
something like Skylanders, but
I mean, it's true. It's true. You start with a console or a PC, and then you fill it with games.
yeah, it is true.
Don't tell your dad about the Steam summer sales.
Yeah, exactly.
It is true, but there's like a spectrum. Like you could say a bookshelf is like that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you bought a bookshelf, so now you have to buy books. So I don't know because obviously there's cultural value to reading a book. So I think there's cultural value to playing a video game, and
We wouldn't be here if we didn't agree.
yeah, there are lots of things in between. Like and I think games can be more on the side of being primarily a consumer product or primarily, something with cultural value. I try to make them have cultural value if I can. It's not easy though.
I had a lot of fun playing through the machine because it was very clear that you had some modern cultural references in there. You were talking about politics, you were talking about unions and dystopian futures, and it was a very interesting game to play in today's society. And I definitely think that it has a very good story and a very good character arc as well. When it comes to actual character development, which is not something you always see in a Game Boy game. Maybe you're playing a platformer or an adventure game. Yes, sure, you might grow stronger, and you might get power ups, but you don't see character progression that way and character development that way. So that was really really cool to see.
Well, for, making comic books, I've studied a lot of like film and stuff like that. And, with comics, unlike video games, you can't really hide behind anything. I mean, you can if you do like really awesome drawings, you can kind of avoid having a plot if you make the whole thing like a battle or a chase scene or something. But you know, I come from a background of reading books, so like to me that even movies that are like that, that rely primarily on excitement and special effects rather than having a plot,
Hmm.
they don't really feel as good to watch for me. So in a lot of ways, I'm sort of a contrarian, and I feel like video games, the story is painfully neglected, and the main reason that people want to quickly skip through text is not because text is worse than gameplay, it's because the writing is bad.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep.
The writing is often bad because the gameplay is designed first,
Hmm.
and then the writing is tacked onto it, which doesn't allow you to integrate the writing with the gameplay or the story progression. And so, when they say like in this game, actions have consequences, your decisions matter. Well, for your decisions to really matter, it has to be that it affects everything. I mean, the machine is fundamentally a game about life. And in life, you can make decisions that ruin your life.
Hmm.
Mm,
And you can make decisions that set your life on a completely different course. But the machine is a dystopia. So the sort of theme of the game is you can make whatever decisions you want, and you can do better or worse,
Hmm.
but you can't, none of the decisions you make are going to change the way that the machine works.
interesting. Yeah.
And it's sort of a counterpoint to a lot of propaganda where, if a person is poor, for example, it's blamed entirely on that person rather than society. And, when you have things like when unemployment gets too low, they change the interest rate to raise unemployment. It's very hard for me to say that a person is entirely responsible for their situation if, organically it's not allowed to happen that everyone has a job.
Yeah, so your fascination with politics and social structures and these things that find their way into the narrative and themes of your games. I recall back to you talking about your experience as a comics creator, that you start with writing the story and then you work on the art. And I'm wondering if that's a similar process to the way that you work on games, right? You do start with story and then transition to what the mechanics and world will be, or what's the order like when it comes to your game creation?
Well, games are a complete pain in the butt because when I make a comic, I come up with sort of the world and characters and then write the story and then I can draw it. For games, it's like hard to know exactly where to start because um, the machine, I feel like, is a non-linear story primarily. It has game mechanics, but the central game mechanic is decisions that you make. In that way, the story is like really tightly woven into the gameplay. Whereas I think, if I think about a game like Mass Effect, the game is like running down corridors with a gun and shooting enemies,
Hmm.
and then there are pieces in between where there's a story, but they're kind of like separate pillars of the game, if that makes
Sure.
sense. Like,
Yeah.
and there are moments that are really cool, like in the first Mass Effect. Some of them, those are like when you're just running around the main area. But as it gets on and on, when you have three games and stuff, and you have to like pretend that everything that you did mattered, you'll find that stuff from a lot earlier becomes a very small footnote
Mm.
uh, that
Sure.
barely affects anything. And I wanted to have the opposite effect in the machine where it really does spider out, and like the whole context of the story is different by the time you reach the end of a path.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to start diving into the machine, which Jonas, the two of us, that's the one that you played. But
Yeah.
I played a little bit of the demo, so I'm lightly familiar with the premise, and I'm curious again, talking about where for that game in particular, you started with it. What was that initial idea that led to creating the machine?
I think it ultimately came about because I think a lot about game theory. There's an idea called the just is it called the just world uh, fallacy?
The just world hypothesis phenomenon fallacy. You're right. The just world fallacy, a cognitive bias where people believe the world is inherently fair and that people get what they deserve.
Yeah. So the just world fallacy is the central inspiration for the machine. It seems like maybe if I made a different decision or I did something differently, the world would be a better place or my life would be better. But the problem is often the society itself that caused the problems. And so uh, the machine, you get to make different decisions.
Hmm.
In the game, you can do all kinds of things. I don't want to spoil it, but you can have, great fortunes and great misfortunes in the game. Things can go really well for you or really badly. They tend to go better the worse of a person you are.
Hmm.
So, in the machine is designed to tell the opposite story that most fiction tells. Most fiction tells underdog stories where, you know, somebody who started at the bottom made it to the top because they were just a hard worker and they were a good person.
Hmm.
But I feel like the best thing about art is when it speaks to truth. And what I've seen in life is
Hmm.
that that's fiction. And so the machine is different. It demonstrates the laws of power. And so in the game, if you are bad, good things happen to you. And if you're good, bad things happen to you. That's the core rule of the machine. Because I do feel like that reflects life more accurately than most fiction. The reason we like movies, most of the time, where the good guy wins in the end, is because it would be really nice if that was how it worked. So it's not designed to make you feel good, but I'm inspired by things like tragedies. I think that when art is made primarily to make money, then it will primarily tell a comforting story to people. But the machine, artistically, I feel like is like forcing somebody to eat their vegetables.
I
Interesting. And Jonas, it seemed like you loved your vegetables.
Yes. So I had a blast playing through this. So you start out, you're this character Gert, lives on the machine, a triangular-ish machine that just eats forests to continue living, and uh, it has a fantastic way of showing you as the character, showing these different paths that you can take. And as you said, it can be easier for you if you're not kind. Absolutely. And I got to choose a few different things, and I spent my whole salary on horse betting, and it was just so much fun exploring the different things that I could do in the game. So you start out as Gert, you take a test and see if you're valuable enough, essentially, to society to have a job, which is very dystopian. So it starts off there, and then you get a choice between I got a choice between two jobs. I could be either a factory worker or a policeman, and I choose to become a factory worker. And as soon as you walk to the factory, the guard in front of the factory says it's so boring working here. And then you go in and you do the work, and you're like, this is so monotonous. So it really feels like you're portraying the pain of the character really well. They share an apartment with a roommate that's disgusting called Toe, and you get to interact with all these fantastic characters in the game there. And I just had a blast trying out different branches and different ideas of what I wanted to do, some leading to great success for me, but less success for others. So it was really cool. So I definitely want to. I usually play the good person route when I play games. I have a really hard time playing an evil character, but on my second playthrough here, I am absolutely going to be playing an evil character and see how that turns out, and choose a bunch of different things. So I'm really excited about trying this again.
I should say that it doesn't just work on a very simple principle because it's not always, there's a lot of moral gray area
Yeah.
in the game. And also, in areas where luck is involved, unlike a lot of games that sort of cheat on your behalf or, you know, just decide it's going to go one way or the other for the sake of the story, they genuinely are just luck. Like, when whether or not you win the horse race, the odds are exactly the way that they seem that they should be. They're 1 in 4. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I spent my entire salary for several days on the horse betting. I was like, I am gonna win big this time, and of course I didn't. I I didn't win a single time, but it was super fun. Even though I was like, I can't buy anything. I have no food at home. The microwave at work is broken, and everything is just bad for me. I still wanted this little small dopamine kick of maybe I'll win it big. So it's just so much fun just exploring. I walked through the entire area that I was allowed into, talked to all the characters, and there are a bunch of surprises in the game. I don't want to spoil it because, as you said, a playthrough takes between 1 and 2 hours, but then you can replay it many, many times. So I don't want to spoil it, but there are some great surprises in the game that I was like, what's happening? So it's just super, super cool. I loved it. I loved it.
The main thing that I don't like in video games is the way that they're so repetitive and predictable because the people that made them don't value your time.
Hmm.
Like you do something and nothing happens and then they tell you to do it another 20 times and it's like, well, I mean, you're just incrementing a variable, but I have to do this and I actually have to do this and it's a huge waste of my time. Like
Yep.
if you didn't make any more stuff, just let me get to the next thing.
Hmm.
That was an experience I had playing Starfield actually. I scanned one of the aliens and then it was like scan it, 100 more times and then we'll tell you about it. And I was like, oh man. So I mean, people are talking about how long this game is, and it's like if this is what makes it long, then I don't like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious how that being something that is opposite of your taste in games, how that impacts your game design. Are there any elements that you like at face value will not include in your games because you think that they fall into those traps that you think other games do?
But maybe it's because I come from a comic background, but I like games that feel handcrafted instead of just making numbers go up. in my game, when you have to make numbers go up, it's like a torturous process. Like, and it's like part of the story. Whereas I think most games, like, people blindly try to complete their objectives. And I think a lot about gamification and the way that gamification is used to manipulate people. And so um, it could be that, if I say, give me $20, you would say no because you don't want to give me $20. But I could say it's a contest to see who can give me $20 the most times. Uh,
Mm.
and then you say no. And then I say, well, you're losing so far. Someone else already gave me $20.
And then suddenly you introduce horse racing in there, and Jonas can't get enough of it.
Well, I'm just saying, that much of the world is like that,
Mhm.
Yeah, of course.
and companies use that to manipulate us. There's so many things that are used to manipulate us in modern society that it makes you feel like you're just a mouse in a maze designed by people that graduated from MIT. So the machine is kind of designed to be like a satirical depiction of that. You kind of are that. You asked me like what specific if I have like red line things that I avoid in a game. So I would say yes. Like I try to make the game handcrafted in a way where like each thing the player sees is something that I made, you
Mm.
know. And so while it can be, it can be A, it can be B. Each of these things are things that I made, instead of just hamster wheels. Like if it feels to me like a hamster wheel, I don't want to make the player do it.
I think that's a really sensible take. Because that, yeah, time is the one resource that we can't remake.
I should say it makes making games a lot more work, and that's the main reason that people do the opposite most of the
Sure.
time. As like because they want to pad out the playtime because and then this comes back to like people who play games being too about numbers as they people equate playtime to value, and I don't feel that way at all. And a lot of my favorite games are short.
Sure.
I really like the game Inside.
Oh, it's a fantastic game.
That has that feeling to me of each part of the game being handcrafted. And if it was up to me, video games would be like movies where each one is 2 hours long
Mm.
and is a beautiful, finely tuned, nicely crafted experience that just ends after a couple hours. That to me is like what games should be like, but it's not the expectation of what games will be.
Those are
Yeah.
my favorite games as well. I don't have 100 hours to plow into every game. I don't need every game to be open world. I want a good story and something that hooks me. And if it's over in less than 10 hours, that's great because that means that I can actually enjoy it and not get stuck on a boss 40 hours in and let the game go. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally agree with you there.
Well, I should say that my favorite way to have my time wasted is for things to be difficult.
Mm,
Mm.
But that is to me a lot more appealing than wasting my time by just making me do something that's easy to do 100 times over and over and over again.
Sure.
I would much rather be challenged.
Yeah.
Like the game Ikaruga is one of my favorite games,
mm,
and that is a game that, like, if I was immortal, like if I was a vampire, uh, I would probably play that game for like 500 years so that I could actually beat it on one continue.
yeah, it's a great bullet hell. It's so good.
Yeah, it just feels, it has that feeling of being carefully crafted.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that making things that are carefully crafted and that aren't repetitive is difficult and time consuming. And that's why it seems like a lot of people and a lot of teams end up avoiding it or taking different routes. And I'm curious how you balance your sort of the work that you put into these games. Like when you sit down to work on your game, are you doing it for 10 hours, you get really into it? Do you try to draw it out over a long period of time? How do you balance that sort of work and life and doing other things while making sure that your games are as handcrafted of an experience as you desire games to be?
Well, that's, I guess, the downside of my preferred method of making games because I would say that I don't have very good work-life balance. I
Sure.
mean, I'm sure that that's true for a lot of game developers, but before my son was born, I would often spend over 12 hours a day working on games and not at a slow pace either. I get distracted easily. So I would have timers that I would set for like 52 minutes. That would be like work sessions where I could do nothing but work on the game. I give myself like 8 minutes to, get a drink of water or check my emails or send someone a message. And then I will set another timer and start again, which is a way to have like a more disciplined working process because I think that a lot of people, I mean, I read an article on this. We're not good at multitasking, and a lot of people that think they are just also bad at multitasking. So I don't ever try to multitask. I just, I guess on Game Boy it would be called single threaded. I can do multiple things, but not at the same time. Yeah, and I can't even listen to podcasts when I am doing game development. I can listen to lyricless music
Mhm.
sometimes, but that's
Yeah.
about the best I can do.
Well, I mean, that work ethic does mean that you are putting out your games at a really impressive clip. I mean, given that, I mean, a 2 hour game is not easy to make. I've seen teams take 7 years to make a game that you can beat in 3 or 4 hours. But then your games also have these layers and different paths to them, as you're mentioning. But you're putting them out very quickly. Just looking at the Machine coming out in 2022, Unearthed and Metamorphosis Collection, both also very recent, and then this year with First Contact Protocol. I mean, and I believe you're working largely on your own on these projects. I mean, this is a really impressive clip that I think reflects the fact that you can just kind of lock yourself in and focus and get a lot done in a short period of time.
I mean, it helps a lot to have a background in comics because comics is actually significantly harder than making
Sure.
games. Uh, every time a person opens their mouth, you have to draw their head again.
Mm. Yep.
Like
Of course.
when
Yeah.
I started making a video game and I just made like a single avatar for a character, and I'm like, wow, every time they talk from now on, I get to just use this same picture. This is like easy street. You know,
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know if either of you are Dragon Ball fans, but to me, this is like Goku wearing the weights, and he has to train with the weights, and he takes them off, and suddenly he feels free and can just do whatever he wants.
yeah, I mean, the programming side is not like that. Sometimes when I'm programming stuff, like I feel like my brain is sweating through my forehead. Like like when I'm doing really difficult stuff. Like when we were doing like the I should say that Unearthed is a collaboration where I shared equally the work with my friend Gumpy Function, Tom, and he did all the level design and everything. But the rest of my projects are largely solo developed, with the exception of the audio, which I've never made music for any of my games. I worked with Lunches and recently with my friend Johnny. So
I wanted to dive into the collection that you released here, the Metamorphosis collection. It's a collection of, where it's a horror anthology, is what you call it. So tell us a bit more about the collection and the games that the collection includes.
man, that one just it's one of those things where some advice I'd give to game developers out there is be careful when you join a game jam because you think that it's going to be a small project, and I've never maybe yeah no I've never done a game jam where the game didn't become a bigger project than I was able, like Unearthed was originally done for a game jam, which we were really lucky and it actually won that game jam. But then it feels like, okay, we spent 3 months on this project, we released the ROM for free, but maybe we should expand this and try, it seems like if it was good enough to win the contest, maybe it has more legs than this, so um, we our final version of Unearthed that we put out, uh, that the physical came out through Limited Run Games, and the digital is still available on itch. That one is about 3 times, maybe a little more, bigger than the Jam version. We thought, okay, well, we're going to make it bigger, but we already have all the basic systems done. So the Jam version took 3 months. So the full version, maybe it'll take 6 or 9, months to finish. But it was like 2 years or something. Like
Yeah, yeah.
it's just as you scale
Scope
up a
creep is a thing.
yeah, as you scale up a project, like the complexity scales exponentially. And so it's really not that easy. So, anyway, to come back to Metamorphosis Collection, I first made a game in about a week for a game jam called Scream FM. And it was very small, there was not very many people in it, and I had been working on the machine for about a year, and I wasn't even close to done, but I just wanted to put something out. I was really tired of working on it. I was getting a bit burned out, and part of the satisfaction of being a game developer is having people actually play your stuff. Working on it is definitely not the fun part. So I joined this game jam, and I figured, I think there's like 15 people in this game jam. So at least those 15 people will play it, and I'll get to make a little game that's just what I want to make for fun. And for some reason that I still don't quite understand, that game was very popular with streamers and YouTubers and stuff. I suspect a big part of it might be that I think it takes only like 15 or 20 minutes to play through the entire thing.
All three games or each one within it?
The first game, which is called Possum Country. It was kind of shocking. I got a ton of traffic to my itch page, and a lot of it coming from YouTube and stuff like that. And it was weird because I'm like working on the machine, and I'm like, I really don't know if the machine is going to get this much attention, even though I've spent like well over a year working on it, and I still probably have at least a year to go. So I talked to my publisher, and they wanted to publish it on a cartridge, but I thought I just can't justify making a cartridge to sell people a 15-minute game. Then I joined another game jam, and I made another horror game called Decline. And I was going to do like a double feature because for horror, that kind of, reminded me of like the Grindhouse movie, stuff like that. After I made the second one, I realized this one's maybe like 20, maybe 25 minutes long. I, I still have like less than an hour of game to make a collection. And so I was like, I don't even think I have enough to put this on a cartridge yet. So then I made the third game on the collection, and the third game is a much more serious endeavor. Like, I don't know exactly how long it is, but it has more game mechanics, more story. It's longer. It has saving because you might actually need to save. And so it's a much more substantial project. And I also tried to push the art further, having like large sprites and doing a lot of experimental stuff. Like in that game, there's a flashlight that actually casts light on things, and there's reflections and ice and water, stuff that you wouldn't even think would be possible on Game Boy, but I managed
Yeah.
to figure out little tricks to get that stuff to work. And so I really pushed it with that one so that I could like finish out the collection. And there's also different difficulties so that it is more gameplay oriented too. It still has a lot of story, but between the story and the difficulty levels, I think that there's a lot of reason to replay that one as well. So I think that one sort of filled out the collection. And then I finally was like, okay, now I'm comfortable putting this on a cartridge.
So this was published by, you said Limited Run Games? physical cartridge?
Unearthed was.
Unearthed was, yes. Sorry.
Metamorphosis Collection was published by Incubate Games, who also published The Machine.
So you've been working with Incubate for a few years then?
Mm-hmm.
What about First Contact Protocol? Is that also Incubate?
That one's through Mod Retro.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So I'm sort of experimenting, trying all the different publishers. If I can give you a little behind the scenes on my thought process with that, it's just that I have another game that I'm working on that's huge, uh,
Ooh.
kind of like The Machine, and I wanted to try working with different publishers so that I can make sure that I know what options are available for putting that game out, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. A little Ben Jelter scoop for today. No, it's exciting. Yeah, and I played First Contact Protocol, and since I haven't played through the machine, I don't know the difference in scope, but that game felt really rich to me in terms of the amount of potential story paths that I could take, a lot of writing, lots of different art, and lots of puzzles and things. You mentioned that the machine was a lot more focused on the narrative before mechanics, but First Contact Protocol is, I almost want to say, a top-down Metroidvania in the way that you're exploring and getting upgrades to your character, then to explore even more of the map, and then also very story-focused. So, talk about the complexity of that game, and also, as I asked about the machine earlier, what was the inspiration for that? What with First Contact Protocol was the first element that you kind of came up with that ended up turning into this game you spent a while working on?
I like the way that you said it's like a top-down
Metroidvania.
Metroidvania. And in my head, I thought of it as a little bit like a Zelda game, because
Ultimately, those aren't that far apart. That's the secret.
I have a friend who calls Zelda games Metroidvanias too, because fundamentally they are like you get an item, you unlock a new area, you get an item, you unlock a new area, and move around. The only difference is one is like from a side view and the other's from a top down view.
Yeah.
But Zelda has a bit more puzzles
Mm.
than a side scrolling Metroidvania usually would have.
Yeah. Might be more action or platforming.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of like my favorite parts of Zelda, but I've replaced combat with story.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Story wise, I'm inspired by games like Police Knots or something like that, where
Mm.
they really go all out telling an actual story. Like in Zelda, I think I don't care about the story. There are moments in games like Majora's Mask where aesthetically I really like, the story beats, but it doesn't compare to games that have like, fully written out stories, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So talk about that story with First Contact Protocol. The basic concept is this: you are an alien, a little goo alien that has boarded a ship that has 6 people on it, and you are trying to find your way around this ship. The alien doesn't have any dialogue, doesn't necessarily have any motivation. It seems, unless you whenever you project onto it, and you explore and mess with the crew members. You make them kind of fight each other, or you goad them into doing different things by exploring and sneaking into the vents and things. And so it's about exploring and seeing what's happening on the ship, between the relationships and dynamics between these people, and also, as I said, upgrading yourself and getting different abilities that let you explore even further, and unlock different endings, make certain paths, story paths, kind of split in different ways. And so the narrative I found really interesting about and generationship and humanity trying to expand to the stars, and different people having different perspectives on that. So lots of layers of satisfying puzzle and exploration gameplay, but also thematically on like a sci-fi and fiction level, I found really, really compelling.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear, you liked it. That's awesome. Cuz that's what I was trying to create, but when you're working on it, you're like, "Oh gosh, does this even work?"
No, I like it a lot. Yeah, I'm a fan of the science fiction series Rendezvous with Rama, and the idea of making first contact with an alien species is something that's very compelling to me. I love the movie Arrival, another story that's based around that, and so just that name alone, I'm like, all right, I'm already sold.
Yeah. Have you seen the movie Contact?
Oh yes, I that is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, that's a very good movie. I like movies where they take alien contact seriously,
Mm-hmm.
because but this game doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like this game just bounces back and forth between it being a serious thing and being a joke, especially if we encountered like a species capable of interstellar travel or something like that. By far the most consequential thing to happen in all of human history. Although I feel like society is becoming increasingly disconnected from significance. Like, really important things can happen, and then really unimportant things can happen next, and they're kind of treated with equal weight. That's not really a theme of the game, but that's just me going off on a tangent.
We'll talk about those themes of the games. What element of the narrative of First Contact Protocol are those themes that you find so fascinating? You're like, I need to tell a story about this.
I played Crusader Kings 3, and in that game, you you have to like curry favor with people. But it's really interesting because things don't always work the way that you want them to work. Like as a sort of, if you're like a teenage boy or something like that, then you might think like, oh, this person's my enemy. I should kill them. But like if they're your enemy in the game and you're the king, you actually have to make it so that they don't rebel against you. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of the time, what you're doing in the game is like paying off your enemies. Like you're like people are fundamentally rewarded for being your enemy because it's easier for you to just give them money to not be mad at you than it is for you to kill them and then piss off all their relatives, have their land revolt against you, have to fight a war, and so that's how you kind of know that this person, even though they're not in charge, I'm in charge. They have power, and for me to be on top of this pyramid, I have to like maintain my power. And so to me, all of that interpersonal interaction is interesting, but I felt like I don't know who any of these people are. They're just kind of like automatons that either hate or don't hate me. And I kind of know why, but it's always the same reason. Like they feel like they should own the land that I have or something like that. So I thought, what if there's a game that's about the complex connected nature of relationships between human beings, but on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
I actually had two ideas based on that. One is a fishing game that is in very, very, very early development that I hope I can finish one day. But this is sort of based on same sort of formula of six people on a ship, the interplay of interpersonal dynamics between them. So I started by trying to give them each their own motivation that would sort of compete with one another in different ways. Some might be able to accomplish their goal without interfering with the goal of other people, but some people's goal is in direct opposition to another person. So those people are less likely to like each other, and you can sort of influence the outcome by things that you do. In the machine, it's very straightforward. Like you make decisions because there's a multiple choice and you select it with a cursor.
Mm-hmm.
First contact protocol, you make decisions by like solving or not solving a puzzle. It's a little bit more disconnected from feeling like a decision. So that was the thing when I made the game that I hope people get the most is that like you can do or not do things to change the outcome.
So, how did you manage the scope of the game? There are six characters. I only got one ending. I don't know how many endings there are. But with a game that can have split paths and multiple endings, how did you make sure to keep it reined in so it didn't, blow out of proportion? You have to work on it for 6 years. What was your kind of idea of like this is how many paths there should be?
Well, it's not easy. First contact protocol is a bit more linear than the machine, so that helps some. That's because if I had to design puzzles for like this number of paths that were in the machine, it would take like 20 years. So, but yeah, you can change quite a number of things and have very different outcomes based on what you do and don't do. Yeah, I just tried to make it so that where things diverge happens later in the game.
Hmm.
So, like, about the first third of the game is the same every time. But unlike the machine, I don't make you play it over and over again. The machine, you do start at the beginning every time, but you can get onto a new path very quickly. Whereas in First Contact Protocol, there's a lot of endings, but it only starts sort of separating closer to the halfway point in the game. And so that makes it a little bit easier to manage.
Yeah, and what about in terms of the apocalyptic narrative of the game? The Earth has decayed. I guess. I mean, I don't really know what has happened to it, but humanity has largely seemingly left the planet and is looking for a new planet to call home. But the game takes a lot of different perspectives on what this could mean for the future of humanity, and I found that really interesting. The sort of warring factions and different thought processes and philosophies that people have, and so science fiction wise, these themes of like the fate of an entire species, the species that we belong to. What about that kind of engages you so much?
I think for First Contact Protocol and for any sci-fi stuff that I write, I'm most influenced by being a big fan of science fiction. But I think I'm interested in a lot of classic science fiction. Like I've read a lot of stuff by Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Philip K. Dick. Back when I was in college, there was a used bookstore down the street, and I could get really cheap little paperbacks with short stories in them. And I used to really like picking those up. I thought they were really interesting. Something that bothers me a little bit about the way that science fiction is used in culture in the modern day, which is it seems that people don't understand the underlying purpose of it, which is sort of critique of the present.
Yeah.
Like the best sci-fi stories, whether it be like RoboCop or something from the 1950s or like Star Trek or something like that. They all imagine like, what if from here we went in this direction?
Hmm.
You know, and some of them are negative and some of them are positive, but the negative ones are usually a cautionary tale, and the positive ones are usually sort of like a target to aim for.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sometimes people dramatically misunderstand science fiction. Like I've seen that with a lot of my favorite cyberpunk stories are like by William Gibson and Neil Stevenson, I think it
Hmm.
is. They imagine a dystopia, sort of like corporate owned world. And I think that a lot of people, own tech companies, they like treat that as their goal, without realizing that those stories were dystopian, or maybe not caring that it's dystopian, because if they're the evil guy in charge of everything, then it doesn't really matter that something bad is happening to everyone else or something. I think that maybe my least favorite science fiction is when there's spaceships and there's laser beams and it takes place in the future, but there's no social commentary whatsoever.
So, what was the social commentary you were mostly focused on with First Contact Protocol?
Yeah, well, that's the thing about First Contact Protocol is it actually isn't that heavy on social commentary
Sure.
because it's a non-linear story. It's a little bit exploring like bouncing sort of like ping pong balls off of one another. The main theme behind the machine is kind of like political, it's like refuting that idea of the just world fallacy. And the main theme of First Contact Protocol is not political in the same way. The main thing I'm exploring in First Contact Protocol is the butterfly effect,
Mm.
uh, where it's like you kind of do something small early in the game, and by the end of the game, it's had a dramatic effect, if that makes sense.
I like that.
And because of the fact that you're on a ship that's like one of humanity's interstellar missions, the significance of the impact of little things is like infinitely multiplied.
Well, yeah, not only that, but one person's goals. If one person is so oriented towards their goal and not thinking about the goals or wants of others, that then in this situation, if they screw over everyone else, it screws over the entirety of humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
But also, I think that for people who want the mission to succeed and for people who want the mission to fail, I want to give them all credible motivations. It's not so black and white that there's obvious good guys and bad guys. You know what
Hmm.
I mean?
Yeah,
Because that, I think, makes a story more human. Because in reality, people are motivated by different things and very often have competing interests and see each other as good and evil, but most people don't conceptualize themselves as evil in the way that,
yeah, of course.
in lazy writing they do. And so I try to like explain everybody's motivations, and I also think that like when a person does something, it can, if you look at it really closely, it can look like they did something evil.
Hmm.
But then when you have a little more context, you realize they did something good. But then if you expand the time scale and look at it like how it affects things over the next 100 years, maybe it becomes bad again.
Hmm.
Hmm.
You see, and so there's this kind of thing where it's like part of whether or not something is good or bad. If you think long term enough, you can justify anything. But also, if you think small enough, then you're not even thinking, So I think that there's interesting themes like that are explored in First Contact Protocol.
Sure, absolutely. Well, now that we covered those games in particular, I before we say goodbye, I'd like to kind of take a look back at you and your experience with GB Studio. It's something that we've mentioned has kind of evolved quite a bit, and each of these different versions of this tool have their own strengths and weaknesses. And as you said, you're kind of familiar with them, so it'd be good to kind of get on the record you as an experience with this software, what those different versions of GB Studio were like, their pros and cons, and how it has evolved over the years.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. I discovered it like I think it was quite new. The developer Chris Maltby made the program originally just to make a game, uh, his own game, and I don't think originally intended to make it like used by other people, but um, made GB Studio 1.0, and it was very simple, but it was also very easy to use. And I just thought it's the most incredible thing in the world that he's managed to make making a Game Boy game easy.
Yeah.
Because even though you can't do everything that you could, you know, in the back in the day theoretically do, everything is so easy to do. Like I don't feel like when I made the machine that my workflow was anything even remotely close to the original Game Boy game developers. Like when they first made Game Boy games, they're like, drawing the sprites on graph paper
Yeah.
and
Mm.
like handing them to a programmer who's like, putting it in assembly, the value of each pixel. And I am using like a super modern graphics program to export a PNG and just drop it in a folder and then hit compile, and boom, I have an animated sprite in the
Yeah.
game.
Yeah.
And so it's like I have a lot of superpowers that they didn't have. You know, like um, I don't have to make my backgrounds uh, from a very limited tile set because it's not a ridiculous amount of work to program the location of every tile in the background into the program. So you know what I can do is I can just draw by hand every environment in my game and then just clean it up so that it has, you know, few enough tiles to fit the tile limit. And you know, when I first started making a GB Studio game, people recommended using tiled, and so you can make a tile set, and then you can like just paint the tiles onto the background. But I kept wanting to edit the tiles, and the backgrounds didn't look that good. And I realized when I was making the illustrations for the scenes that weren't like the backgrounds, that I could just like with the illustrations, the tile limit wasn't that limiting. And so then I thought maybe I can just draw all the environments. And
Mm.
so that's what I did for the machine. Like each scene, and then for all my subsequent games too, each scene is hand drawn, um, and then optimized to fit within the Game Boy's tile limit. And so when I first started using GB Studio, I'll try to stay on subject a little bit. Um, it was just green scale. There was no color at all.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I started developing a fantasy game. I think I called it Witchblood. And I worked on that for a couple months, but I learned so much working on it that it felt terrible, like it was a really bad game compared to what I was capable of at that point, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had learned a ton about GB Studio, but I thought rather than restart this, I had two more ideas. One was a sci fi game, and the other was The Machine. And The Machine just spoke to me. Like, I felt like thematically everything came together in a way that it made the most sense to make it like as a passion project, if that makes sense. When I started The Machine, it did not, I didn't, I did not, I kind of felt like everybody that I talked to about Game Boy games, it never in a million years occurred to me that I would make a penny making it. Uh, like I just thought like this is a passion project. It matters so much to me that I make a Game Boy game before I die that's good, that I don't care. I'm just going to invest a couple years of my life in it and then probably never even touch game development again because it's going to be so much work and so little money. But, you know, fortunately it did okay. So, you know, I'm still making Game Boy games. Yeah, originally in GB Studio 1.1, they did not have color. And then in GB Studio 1.2, they added color, which I thought was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But in GB Studio 1.2, you could only have one palette for the entire game.
Hmm.
So there's four colors total in Game Boy. There's white, light green, dark green, and black. And so you can make each of those four colors whatever color you want, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
You have four colors. So you would not believe how much time I spent trying to come up with a palette that would allow me to create like infinite variety with only four colors. So I had to come up with a palette that I could kind of like use to imply light and shadow with different colors, and also would thematically fit the game, wouldn't look too desaturated, but that the colors wouldn't be too biased in a certain direction. And so this GB Studio 1.2, I think, is a very interesting program, um, because it forces you to make these uh, important artistic decisions,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like choosing exactly four colors to use for the entire project. Like it makes it GB Studio 1.2 a very interesting program to me, and I think you know besides whatever the latest version of GB Studio is, my next favorite version of GB Studio is 1.2. Uh, of course, I like also, because I'm an artist and all of that. I like having all the caps removed from everything so I can do whatever I want. But there's a lot to be said, like people like Pico 8, people like Bitly, people like programs to make games in that have limitations
Hmm.
because it sort of prevents you from being able to do infinite feature creep or waste tons of time. GB Studio is really nice for UI because you don't have to decide like how big your font's going to be or something like that. It's your characters are definitely going to be 8 by 8 pixels. These are
Yeah.
things that you could like if you're making a PC game, you could like endlessly re-legislate and just spin your wheels forever.
Hmm.
And so I think it like limited options are like an accelerant for game development. Like it helps you get to the part where you're making the game instead of endlessly spinning your wheels a lot faster. And so GB Studio is, in my opinion, the perfect version for that. Has a lot of limitations, but limitations are not always a bad thing in my opinion. I found it to be almost like writing or playing Sudoku, making games for GB Studio 1.2, Whereas like once I got to GB Studio 3, it started to feel like, wow, what's possible in the program is actually more than I'm capable of.
Interesting.
Whereas in GB Studio 1, it felt like, oh, I'm hitting my head on the ceiling, you know,
Sure.
like I can do more than it will let me. But now it feels like it's possible to do more than I can. Like with animation, for example, like if somebody is like a professional 2D animator, like they could do really incredible stuff in GB Studio 4 that would have been 100% impossible in GB Studio 1 or 2. Um, so I'm an illustrator, not an animator, right? So I can make the individual frames look good, but like an animator could probably do like really cool like squashing and stretching and all this stuff. It gets to the program where instead of being like frustrated by the program's limitations, you're intimidated by them.
Hmm.
Because it's like, wow, we could do anything now.
Sure.
um, and there's also stuff on the programming side that got a lot easier, as later versions came along. GB Studio 2 is the one that I made the machine in, and the one that we made Unearthed in.
Mm.
Uh, GB Studio 2 Beta 5, because GB Studio 2 never came out of beta. And that's probably for the best because GB Studio 2 had some, it introduced like things like time update scripts where like an actor can have a script attached to it that runs at the same time as the other code. And so uh, GB Studio 1 was limited to a single thread, which meant that like if I want this character and this character to both move down at the same time, that's not possible. You literally can't do that.
Hmm.
The only way to do it would be to move this character down by 1 pixel and then this one down by 1 pixel and so on. You could fake it.
Hmm.
However, in Studio 1, it didn't have the ability to move by pixels. You could only move by tiles. So, and it was functionally impossible in GB Studio 1. Um, and I made a lot of the machine in GB Studio 1 before porting it to 2. Porting it to 2 was not easy, but I had to do it because 2 is where they introduced full color. And I just felt like one palette is too limited.
Hmm.
However, GB Studio, I didn't know how it would work. So a lot of my backgrounds were not constrained to the tile grid. And what that means, you can only paint a palette onto a tile on the Game Boy Color. You can't just paint everything whatever color you want. you can use multiple palettes, but you can only use one palette per background tile. So I had to do a lot of like repair work on my backgrounds to get um, my backgrounds to work, and you can still see some little rough edges in some spots in the game, which I'm polishing up if I ever manage to release it on PC. Um, so that was huge. Now, around the time that they did that, I proposed something on the GitHub which I thought would never happen, but it was like a pipe dream. But um, I thought it's really annoying that in my image editing program, I have, uh, I might be getting a little ahead of myself, but I have like a full color image, and then I
Mhm.
have to convert this full color image into the 4 Game Boy Greens, import it into GB Studio, and then recolor it using palettes in GB Studio. It's like I'm undoing work and then doing it again.
Mhm.
So my big wish was if I just have a PNG that fits the limitations, that GB Studio could automatically apply the palettes to the tiles, which I thought is potentially a very unreasonable request, but also GB Studio already goes through each tile and identifies whether or not it's unique and compiles it together into a background, you know. So it's already taking PNGs and working with the tiles. So I thought maybe it's possible. And amazingly, they did add that feature, I think in maybe GB Studio 4.1.
That's
Um,
great.
and so, yeah, and that's so amazing because I can just make a cool illustration that fits the limitations and just import it straight into GB Studio, and it's done. It's amazing. But that was in 4. But I didn't talk about you know GB Studio 2. It felt like they had a lot of new features, but it was based on a soft foundation. And so, like in Unearthed, what we really wanted to have was the ability to like hold down a button to the side and then move multiple tiles. But we needed to be able to count those tiles. But the way that the program was working, it would just repeatedly, like every frame, do the script from the button,
Mm.
and there was no way to stop that from happening. Uh, So if we wanted it to like increment a variable, it would do that the first frame and the second frame and so on. And I tried to do like a variable to lock it out. Like as soon as this happens, set this variable to this, and then this next thing stops it from happening. But even that wasn't executing properly. So it leads me to think that maybe like it started the thread and then started it again before it even got to the first step on the next frame because the Game Boy like processor is so slow. I couldn't really understand it. It didn't seem to make sense in terms of like machine logic to me, but it was unworkable. So we had to remove the ability to move multiple tiles at a time in order to be able to accurately count the number of tiles that you moved in that game.
Mhm.
And so all these little compromises were coming up from the multi-threaded nature of GB Studio 2. Um, and as somebody who had spent significant amount of time in GB Studio 1, it made the program feel less reliable to me. Because I felt like before everything happened exactly the way I told it to. And then starting with GB Studio 2, I felt like I'm not sure exactly how this is going to work, or maybe it's going to bog down the processor because it can't handle being given all these instructions at the same time. And this comes back to my original point that people are bad at multitasking. So is the Game Boy.
Ah, interesting. Ah,
Yeah. The Game Boy is very bad at multitasking, just like me. Um,
that's almost such a good full circle point.
I
You
love
got to
that.
end on that.
GB Studio 3 completely fixed so many problems It's ridiculous, and so it makes sense that 2 was in beta the whole time, and
Mhm.
3 was the next version after 1.2 to be out of beta. But it was a long wait. It was like a couple of years that GB Studio 2 was the most up to date version. Um, so when 3 came out, it was like I wasn't done with the machine yet. And I was so sad that I couldn't make a game in it yet. Like that I had to
No.
finish my game before I could make a game in GB Studio 3 because like it removed so many limitations that we'd been dealing with from the beginning. Like all of that stuff that I was just talking about was solved overnight by GB Studio 3 because in GB Studio 3 whenever you want you can lock and unlock a script, which means that like when somebody presses a button, if I really need that event to happen with 100% consistency, then as soon as the button's pressed, the first event that I make is lock the script. And then I can be sure that it's not going to run that script a second time. They also added the ability to make large sprites. Every sprite up until GB Studio 3 had to be 16 by 16 pixels,
Mm.
nothing bigger. If you wanted to have a single sprite that's larger than 16 by 16 pixels, you had to make multiple sprites that are 16 by 16 pixels and then just put them on the screen next to each other. But like I said, you cannot move two sprites simultaneously. So those sprites all had to be stationary.
Mm.
Nothing that moved on the screen could be bigger than 16 by 16 pixels. And there was no way around it. And so there was one way around it. You could pin it to the screen and then just move the camera, but obviously that's not going to give you much control. Uh, yeah, so we used that trick for a fancy scene in Unearthed, but it couldn't be used for a whole lot.
That's smart.
Yeah, and so then in GB Studio 3, that was a good program. The only project I've made in 3 is Metamorphosis Collection. And then all the rest I ported to 4 because actually migrating from 3 to 4 is not that bad. If you do it, there's not a heavy cost to pay in terms of development time. Whereas moving from 2 to 3, that was a gap I was not willing to cross, especially on these giant projects I had going on at the time. It would have unlocked a lot of stuff that I could have done, but I would have spent months just, sprites alone, because sprites could have a palette assigned to them in GB Studio 2, and in GB Studio 3, there's like a sprite animator sort of side program that you assign which sprite palette it's using, and then you assign sprite palettes to the scenes. So the way that that works is completely different. So every single sprite and every single scene would have to be replugged in, recomposed. Um, Maybe the migration process was pretty good, but I never really chanced it. Um, so yeah, GB Studio 3 introduced a lot of things, but so I would consider GB Studio 3 like when GB Studio really blossomed into like a full-fledged Game Boy game maker that's good, really good to use, like where it doesn't feel like you're um, like you're having to endure too much pain. I
Mhm.
mean, the first version, introduced a lot of crashes and stuff like that. Uh, but a lot of it was because we didn't understand the limitations yet and we were getting greedy. Like you couldn't have more than 40 sprites on the screen at a time, but at that point it's kind of like, you're flying pretty close to the sun. I mean, that's a lot. So, um
Did you see an influx of new developers when 3 was released as well?
absolutely. Yeah. I think that 3 uh the program blew up a lot. I don't know exactly why, but you could do a lot more with it, so that makes sense. Um, would I say it's easier to use than 2? Probably. Yeah, I would say 3 is easier to use than 2. Not than 1, but I would say it is easier to use than 2. The only thing that's a little bit difficult is you have to compose your sprites. Um, and so that does mean that like you don't have the drag and drop, just drop a PNG and then you have a sprite. Like you now need to, make a sprite sheet, take the sprites and arrange them on like an animation, thing. And it's very powerful,
Hmm.
but it does require a better knowledge of how it works than GB Studio One did. So you know, anyone who wants to get into GB Studio, I would tell them get GB Studio 1.2, like make a little something,
Hmm.
and then get GB Studio 4. Once you feel comfortable with 1.2, it'll let you do more faster, which is fun, I think. And because as a developer, I do think if you start trying to make something and you encounter difficulty early, and then you don't get to see the results of the things that you want to make, and you're just spinning your wheels for a while, it will make you quit. Like
Yeah,
I don't know. Some people are more determined than others, but uh, you you can be. I mean, for me anyway. Um, I quit everything else, before I got far enough because I wasn't 100% sure. And, day after day, investing your time and working on something and not being sure if in the end you're going to be able to finish a game. Um, once it's a week, it's 2 weeks, you start to look at the calendar and look at your clock and be like, you know, how much of my life am I spending on a potential nothing, you
mhm,
know? Uh, so it really helps to have something to show quickly. I think we kind of need dopamine.
Sure.
for
uh,
sure.
yeah, and so yeah, GB Studio 3 was like the second coming of GB Studio, and I think the the stuff that it introduced is great. GB Studio 3 had a lot of bugs at first. GB Studio 3.1 fixed a lot of those bugs really, really quickly. I wasn't sure how long it was going to take for that update, but they turned it around really fast. Um, and I would say that GB Studio 3 is really great, and I had a lot of fun using it. But GB Studio 4, which is the one that we're basically on now, 4.2 is in beta, 4.1 is not in beta. Um, I would say that 4 focused a lot on quality of life things. I
Hmm.
believe that auto coloring, the PNGs might have been added in 4. Um, uh, they provided a lot of great tools for backwards compatibility. So, for example, making a game for Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy at the same time is not a very straightforward process. Um, in GB Studio 3, every color is sort of assigned to another color in a sort of linear way. In GB Studio 4, you can assign a different background for a scene for the original Game Boy and for the Game Boy Color. And
Oh.
this lets you do very nice things. Like, for example, you could change the organization of the palettes around for the original Game Boy versus the Game Boy Color and sort of make the scene read better um, than it would if you just sort of translated each of those colors from the palettes for Game Boy Color. So I know I'm getting a little into the weeds. I don't know.
No, this is great, because I think it's really useful for anyone looking to dive into developing a Game Boy game. And as we're sitting here talking about this, I have a bunch of ideas that I want to try out as well in GB Studio. So yeah, I think maybe my first game is going to be a Game Boy game as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Gotta make sure you use 1.2 though.
yeah, exactly. I'll start with 1.2 and then go forward from there. But yeah, this is super interesting, and I think you're adding a ton of great context to anyone who's wanting to dive into developing for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color.
Oh, one thing I should say is if you're a programmer and you're great at programming and you want to like peel off the top layer of GB Studio and get into the code itself, um, you probably don't want to use one uh, ever
Okay.
because uh, it only has the visual scripting stuff. Well, maybe it was in three actually. They introduced something called like GBVM, which is an event where you can basically just like write your own code that you're like injecting into the project. Um, and at first in GB Studio 3.1, I used it a lot because a lot of events that were useful, like locking the script or replacing a tile on the background, were only accessible through GBVM. But in like I said, GB Studio 4 is like a big quality of life uh, like update, and so they turned a lot of the most commonly used GBVM events into vanilla events that you could use like to replace a background tile or lock the script with an actual event called script lock instead of having to open GBVM and type in VM underscore uh, lock or something like that. Yeah, or unlock. So um, while it was simple enough, it makes everything more user friendly now. It's discoverable, right? Like before I discovered it, just by talking to people on Discord, but now you can discover it by like typing in script and it's like one of the things that pops up, so that's pretty cool. And it's like documented now, which is awesome. Because to me, script lock and unlock are by far the most powerful thing. Starting, I think, with GB Studio 3, they introduced the ability to take global variables into custom events, which was also a huge development. And in GB Studio 4, they introduced constants, which is amazing. So that's basically giving a name to a number. You like it just like if I say if I type in like starting life, like the character's starting life, then I can use that as a like as if it's a variable throughout the entire project. And then if I decide late in development I want the character to start with 4 life instead of 3, I can change it. And the thing that's so amazing about this is when it compiles, it just changes that variable to a number in every single instance throughout the entire project. So it doesn't, it's, yeah, I think machine, like the comment, how Game Boy development really makes you appreciate how computers are machines, because you're so close to like the hardware level, like where like you're like actually flipping bits and stuff, where like and then that is kind of like part of the inspiration for the machine too is like everything feels like a little lever I'm pulling,
Hmm.
um, and it's interesting to think like, oh, there's all these little machines and then they're stacked on top of each other and then they do this and then it adds complexity and more and more and more and more complexity, and then eventually you have life itself which is all just built on very simple things.
To summarize this, essentially, when if someone wants to start developing Game Boy Color game, absolutely try out 1.2 first. Then, would you recommend jumping up to the latest? Is that kind of the gist of it?
I think so, yeah. uh, I think since version 3.0 to 4.2, every single version has just been improving the program. It's really a great program now, but it's kind of like Unity or something, like where, if you just jump right in, it's like, I think it's a bummer to have to learn how to use the sprite animation editor before you can make anything.
Hmm.
I think if you make something that fits the old requirements, it does import it properly the way that it used to.
Okay.
So, but the problem is people can't restrain themselves. Like they may know that you can do that, but they're not going to because they're not forced to. You know what I mean? They're gonna instead spin their wheels on the sprite editor at first. And I can't stress enough how satisfying it is to just make a little character and walk them around on a Game Boy. And because I mean, I always thought, especially in like 2010, sometime around then, if you make a Game Boy game, you're like psychotically good at programming. Like you're like programming an assembly or so.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like that's not just a programmer. That's like, I mean, there are actually other things, uh, and I think I should mention it. GB Studio is built on top of something. I think it's GBDK.
Mm-hmm. GBDK 2020.
Yeah, and for programmers, they might be interested in this because it is it's an in between layer, where you don't actually I don't think have to program in assembly to use it. I could be wrong though because I'm not a programmer. It's an interesting tool to look into for people who are coming from a background of computer science instead of illustration, because it's very flexible. And I've seen people make platformers and stuff with way less limitations than GB Studio has. Uh, Although the lines are becoming blurred as GB Studio gets better and better.
And for anyone listening or watching here, on the GitHub page for GBDK 2020, we'll link this in the show notes as well. There's a really amazing list of games that have been made using GBDK 2020. So definitely check that out if you're interested in learning more about the games that can be made, the types of games that people have made. Definitely check that out as well.
And technically, I think all GB Studio games are also made with it.
Yeah, I think they might include all the GB Studio ones that have been reported to them or something like that. But yeah, it's a great list of some really amazing games, some demos and stuff like that as well. I tried a few on my own Game Boy Color here, and it's so cool to see these amazing graphical demos. I was a big demo enjoyer in the 90s. So seeing them or similar kind of themes being portrayed on the Game Boy with such a limited hardware is just amazing. So yeah, it's really cool to see. If you want to try to see what the Game Boy is actually capable of, absolutely try out some of those graphical demos there.
The GB development scene goes back way further than GB Studio. It just it just keeps growing exponentially. It seems, which is funny because the hardware itself is so old, but everyone wants to play Game Boy. Really, I actually teach college classes, and a lot of my students like Game Boys, even though they were born like way after. Maybe their parents got them into it or
Mhm.
something. I've had students come to class with Game Boy Color and ask me for game recommendations and stuff.
That's amazing. I love that.
Wow, you were born like a couple years after that was made. But it makes sense because I was born like around when the NES came out, and I like the NES. So yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I want to thank you, Ben, for being an amazing guest here on our little dev interview that we do here at HitSave. And Tucker, I want to thank you for being a fantastic interview host as well. This has been super, super fun. So, Ben, where can people find you and your games and more about GB Studio?
Well, GB Studio actually has its own itch page, itch.io. Um, So if you just go to itch.io and type in GB Studio, you can find it. And hopefully you can find the older versions too. I think that they're still there. I guess I'm just Ben Jelter, Jelter, .itch.io. I try to keep it updated, have all my projects on there, even if I'm not selling the ROMs on there. But there will at least be links to where you can find stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and you link out to the physical copies as well. As you all know, I'm a big game collector too, so I'm looking to potentially get some of those physical collector's items as well, because I do enjoy the Game Boy. So this is really great. And Tucker, where can people find you?
I have many more game dev interviews on a show called Dev Dive on my YouTube channel, Backlog Banter. If you enjoyed this one, there's a good chance that you'll enjoy the other ones as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. This has been super fun. And thank you again, Ben and Tucker, for being a part of this interview. See you next time.
Thanks for having me.